I'm very excited about this because it's got the best title of today. It's queer clubbing. So I'm going to introduce Edel Cronin, who is going to talk to you about queer clubbing. Over to you.
Thanks, Benny. Good morning, everyone. I hope you're enjoying today as much as I am. Today, I'm going to speak about queer clubbing, but in particular, the idea of creating intentionally queer spaces in our educational settings. I describe myself as being very Irish, very queer, and very dyslexic. And that's whether I'm working in my job as vice principal, where I lead on outcomes, or when I'm doing data across the trust, or in my personal life. These things don't separate just because I'm in an office or I'm going in to do a review of the school. But when I do talk about queerness specifically, one of the things and one of the challenges that people come up is this idea of, but what about the other protected characteristics? And I think Audre Lorde said it best when she said, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. One way of illustrating that is the slide on the screen shows all of the different people that the staff in our school chose to put on their doors as part of a poster campaign we ran for Pride last year. By staff choosing queer voices to amplify, celebrate, and elevate, we also ended up doing the same around breaking stereotypes around gender, around ageism, around disability, around race, ethnicity, and so many other things. So by focusing on even just one protected characteristic, you end up celebrating, amplifying so many others. We do set very intentional time in our school to be able to do this. Every single term has a different theme, and those themes track across to our student activism groups. When we were reflecting on the work we've been doing in recent years, planning for this academic year, one of the things we really wanted to try and work on was looking at liberation through coalition of our different intersectionalities and also our different activism groups. And one of the texts that we looked at when thinking about this was Emma Darby's What White People Should Do Next. One of the key quotes that I keep going back to when thinking about intentionality, when looking at protected characteristics, queerness, and coalition across the other groups in our school, is this one that's on the screen. It is vital to remember, while coalition building, that we cannot subsume everything under one single struggle, but that is exactly why we need coalition of shared interests. So that might seem that there's a bit of a clash between what I said at the start about intentional spaces and what I'm talking about now, where we're thinking about that idea of broader context. But like you see in this quote, we can't just put everything under the umbrella term of diversity or inclusion. We do also need to think about how that operates and intersects with other areas. In our school, we have a variety of different things going on. Unfortunately, the way the slides are presented here, you can't see some of the text behind, but we do a range of different things in our school to ensure that there's intentional opportunities for education so that we can build towards that idea of coalition. On the screen here, you have a collage of everybody being involved in Pride last year, and you can see it was a really whole school event. There's also a list on there of speakers we have had in throughout this academic year who also happen to be LGBTQ+, but they were in during times like, for example, Science Week to speak about their particular specialism or area of interest. So when we're talking about building intentional queer spaces, we're not saying that that's the only thing that should happen in an educational setting, because absolutely we need to educate everyone in our buildings. But we do also need to think about when we do the work, like the examples on the slide here, where we have a whole school pride or we have speakers coming in throughout the year, there is also an impact on the queer people who are in that building. the image on the screen is a picture of a camogie match. All of the people in green support Limerick. All of the people in red support Cork. Broadly speaking, in a game scenario like that, when a goal is scored or a point is lost, you want to make sure that you're with people who are supporting the same team as you. It's really simple. You know, you don't want that red jersey in a sea of green when they're all celebrating and you're commiserating, or vice versa. What that looks like for queer people is, even when we are in a space where maybe queerness is being educated, like for example, an assembly, or we have a poster campaign running across the school, there is a risk, and an increased risk, unfortunately, at these times for hate, shame, or at the worst case, violence. And that's where you want to make sure you do have spaces where, like the supporters at this camogie game, you are surrounded by people who have the same shared experience as you and support you in that way. Two of the ways that I look at this in my life is our student group, who are pictured here on screen with all of the fantastic flags. And I also am involved in a network for queer educators across the Southwest. And that's pictured there with the tree. Now, going back to that sports analogy, if I were talking to you about the roller derby team I'm involved in, or the various sports team we have in school, I would be showing you photos where there are smiling, happy faces involved in the activities that we do. However, because I'm talking about LGBTQ plus clubs or networks for queer professionals, we have to be sensitive and mindful to the either personal or professional impact of those people and their queerness being public. Some of people are like me and comfortable and have little impact on a daily basis when it comes to their queerness. However, others still need to access those spaces and know that they're secure spaces, so that they can also have a space for their queerness, but also continue in their personal and their professional lives without there being a risk. That also allows us, for when we are having those moments of education in our school settings or in our other educational settings, that the queer people in our building, including staff, because I think sometimes that does get overlooked, are able to then come to a club, come to a network meeting and reflect on what that was like. In our queer club, I have to be really honest that the current iteration of it started from a really difficult conversation. In our school, when you walk into our atrium, we have flags that represent every nationality, every gender and sexual identity of the people in the building. So we really, patted ourselves on the back for a couple of years and went, oh, this is going really well. But about 2 or 3 years ago, some of our students came and said, we think these things actually need to be happening. And we listened to them, and we're still figuring out our way around that. And I really liked what was spoken about at the start of today's Diverse Ed session about listening, because through listening, we've been able to provide space such as exercise and wellbeing classes, which are for queer people, looking at having speakers and educational settings in specifically for the queer club, not just for those who are in the whole school space. So there's that shift between having the time for education and coalition, but also having a safe space which will affirm, support, and educate queer people, so we can move towards those photos that I showed you where people had their faces hidden, being affirmed and being confident that we're living in a society where they don't need to worry about that. On the screen are some suggestions of groups or organizations that we've worked with across the year, which I'd really recommend. And the thought that I want to leave you with today is this quote from Travis Alabanza: "Liberation isn't liberation if it's contingent on politeness." When I talk about creating queer-specific spaces, whether that be virtually or in person in our educational settings, everyone's not going to be on board with that concept. We're still working under the shadow of Section 28. We need to ensure that we take up space, that policy is in place to support queer people, and we're focusing on that liberation, not the politeness. Thanks very much for listening, everyone, today. I'm going to swap over to the Q&A.
Edel, the breadth and depth of the work you're leading on is staggering. It's really, really impressive to see. And I think it was great that you reflected on it's iterative, that, I mean, it works, but then we get feedback and then we kind of move it forward. So can I ask you a question that comes up quite a lot about schools where there aren't necessarily out staff, but the children want an LGBT or queer space? Is it appropriate for a heterosexual person to hold that space for the young people? Or how do you go about framing that space if you haven't got any out staff?
I think even whether you have out staff or not, you need to create a space where you've considered before going into it what the purpose of that is. So if that space is a room where students feel safe, then that person can monitor that room, supervise that room. If it's a space where you want to talk about education and listening, then do work with organizations like some of those that we've had speak today, so that they are able to do that part kind of, you know, on behalf of the adult who maybe doesn't have that lived experience. And the reason we set up the Queer Network for the Southwest educators, and why I work with, you know, in networks like ASCL, or there's NEU network, so many others as well, is because that's normal, isn't it? To be maybe have one person or maybe one ally, but not lots and lots of queer people in the building. So reaching out to those other networks, I think, is really, really important too.
Yeah, brilliant. And like you say, there's quite often more intentionality around the student spaces than there are around the staff spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And Jay Bonner's just put in the chat that there's only 2 out members of staff at their school. So the expectation is that they should be the ones organising the queer space.
Mm-hmm.
But we wouldn't leave it to the people who are disadvantaged to sort out the disadvantage policy in a school. So I think it's a weird mindset, isn't it? That people do wait for the person with lived experience to perhaps do this work.
Yeah, and I think it's about listening to those people, but not necessarily expecting that they will be the one actioning those things, and tapping into those networks of people who do want to be sharing their lived experience, whether that's, you know, through diversity role models or elsewhere. But having that idea that when we do something whole school, that really isn't enough, because the impact of that on the people with whatever protected characteristic it is, that in itself can create, you know, space that they need to even just think about it, not just looking at homophobia and transphobia, but, you know, do we give the people with the protected characteristic a space to be able to both be listened to, but also reflect and support one another? Because particularly with queerness, one of the, you know, the privileges, if you like, that it's a bit of a weird word, but a privilege that we have as queer people is that it's sometimes hidden. For some of us, it's not, but for some of us, it is. So unless we create intentional queer spaces, like was done, you know, through queer communities in the past when it was more illegal than it is now, we're not always able to find each other. And I think particularly in education, you could be existing in a building with somebody for decades and not know. So it does need to be that intentional creativity around creating that space.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we just bridge into the intersectionality of visible queerness when you are a person of colour, and thank you so much for your signposting in the week to Hidayah, because how we navigate that intersectionality, particularly in a faith context. Like, do you want to just talk about the work you've done in building understanding across different protected characteristics? Yeah,
the slide when I was talking about what we do across the school, underneath those nice photos was a list. So I'll put that up on Twitter afterwards, because the animation I didn't realise would not work here. But one of the things we've looked at is very much looking at our own context. So in our city, we do have religious churches or speakers who are LGBT plus inclusive. So the first thing is about tapping into that, so that you are able to show that whether your personal religious beliefs are different to this, there are sections of every religion which do support LGBTQ plus people. That has to be from senior leadership or whoever the leaders of that educational setting, you know, leading that, I think, and supporting that. And part of that is around policy. So, you know, do you have a script? Do you have a policy that supports if somebody challenges that conversation around religion and queerness, that you know what to say, you know what your school's stance is, and also that if something's reported, through your behavior policy, you don't just brush it aside and say, well, actually, because of that person's belief, then it's not homophobic or it's not transphobic. So, you know, the leadership, the policy, and making sure that we're really clearly scripting those conversations in advance, I think.
Brilliant, Edel. Honestly, there's so much for everyone to take away there. And I want to say thank you for how much you do signposting in the Mighty Network as well. So if you're not in our community space, please do join us. Edel is constantly signposting and answering questions, and she's very active in the ASCL LGBT network as well. So if you're part of ASCL and you want to be part of that group, please do have a look at the Mighty Network and connect with Edel and colleagues who have created that safe space for adults across the country as well.